So if we make a start, it's just turned 12:30, just to give us time to get through some materials and then have a discussion. And if people come along, then that's great. But if not, then just the two of us as well is great. And the meeting's been recorded now, so I know other people can pick it up later. Joe and Monica, it's fine if you want to use the discussion board, and I'm reasonably good at picking up on things as we go along. And as ideas or questions come into mind, you can either shout them out, either Monica through the microphone or through the chat. So I've never done this before in terms of a webinar. I've spoken to people over the years about writing, of course I have, and I have a reasonably good track record of writing. And I think the first thing to say is that for most academics, writing for publication is not something that they're born with, and it's not something that many people can sit down and just do. And I think it's important to realize that, because often, well, largely we just see a piece of work that's been published, or we might recognize an author's name who seems to publish a lot. And I think I've only ever met maybe 3 people who can write a paper very quickly. And there was one guy I met who literally could just sit down and write, and it would near enough, be fairly successful. So those people are few and far between. So what I'm going to do is go through a few themes which I think are quite important to start thinking about if you haven't already done so. And then we can pick up some discussion and start to think about the next steps as well. And I think the very first thing to think about is the whole why. I don't know how it is on your screen, but on my screen, the little person's head has been chopped off. So it's about why do you want to publish? And the reason I think it's important to answer this question, or to have a sense of this question, is writing for publication takes a lot of commitment, and it's not something that just happens quickly. And there's also various ways, particularly now because of Web 2 and everything, there's a whole set of different avenues down which people might publish. I suppose I'm going to gear this webinar more to writing for publication in an academic journal. But just to point out, I think it's also important to explore opportunities through blogging, blog sites, particularly blog sites that are related to either the discipline or the research question that you are interested in, the condition, or the particular policy. So, and one of the things that blog sites can be helpful for is that you can get feedback off people as well in terms of some of your thoughts. Now, of course, on blog sites and other online avenues, they're not looking for a whole 5,000 word piece of work. But I think, in 500 words or so, I think you can tend to get a flavor of some aspect of the research review that you've been looking at. One of the things that increasingly is used to assess certainly academics' work is things like the number of hits or the number of people they get linking into them on things like blog sites, or I also think Facebook and Twitter, if either of you use those, I find Twitter is exceptionally helpful to get feedback about certain thoughts I might be having, or to find out additional literature on a particular topic. So generally, though, that when we're thinking of publishing something, we're wanting to get our message out to the wider world. And I think we need to think about who is it that we want to get the message to, which initially might seem straightforward, But I think we need to start thinking about, okay, probably doing a dissertation, which involves a huge body of work, but now it's about thinking, but from that, what particular part of that do I want people to know about? And where are those people? Who are those people? So I shall give you an example. I have been doing some work with an academic here where we've developed a game with an app, but also where they go out on the street to educate people about antibiotic drug resistance. My colleague, she thinks that it ought to be published in a journal that is more specific to antimicrobial resistance and antimicrobial chemotherapy and those types of topics. Whereas I think, well, actually, I want it to be published in a health promotion or public health journal because it's much more geared towards educating members of the public. Depending on which one we choose, will have some impact on the direction that the paper then goes down. So this leads then into the what. What aspect of your work are you wanting to publish? Now, I find that a number of different factors, which we'll go through, start coming into shaping what the paper might end up like. Some of that is going to be what aspects of the work you're going to publish, and then also that fits into the first question of why. Now, this might seem a silly question, but often we publish things once we've completed a piece of research. But what's very important really, and something we need to start thinking about more from my perspective, is that it's also possible to publish components of your research even before it may have been completed. And in particular, there's certain journals which will now publish study protocols. And one of the reasons they do that, or one of the reasons why that can be helpful, is because it then gives people a reference point when they're looking at the research itself to give some credibility to the way in which the work has been done. So it's not always the finished article. Often when we're publishing things before the work has been completed, before the research outcome is known, it can be a bit more discussive, or it might be a commentary, or it might be a critique, or it might be a review of the literature, again, depending on the audience. Now, one of the big considerations is where you're going to publish, or where you would like to publish the work. And a number of issues need to be considered here. So we need to start thinking about a particular journal, and the journal needs to be interested in what it is you want to publish. And there's several ways of finding that out, and you've probably already got a sense of what journals you would like to approach, because they're often the journals from which you've been getting literature for as part of the research that you've been doing. Another way is to think about looking at the requirements from a particular journal, and they very clearly specify the types of articles that they're willing to consider. And in terms of the linking this to the what you're going to publish, it's again about thinking about the audience. So obviously you want to publish in a journal that is more likely to be a journal that the people you want to influence are going to read. Now, publishing in journals has changed in terms of the financing of it in recent years, because there's an increasing focus, and rightly so, on having journal articles to be open access, so that anybody outside of here is able to access the journals and the journal articles without having to pay. What that has done is it's had a major influence on the access for authors to journals, because for a lot of them, we now have to pay to get something published. And it can be thousands of pounds, or it can be hundreds of pounds. But there are also journals that don't charge the author anything, and they will get their money either through advertisement or in terms of recuperation from some of the funding bodies. So it's very important at this stage when you're looking at the journals to also think about what are their publication fees, if there are any that are going to be applicable to you. And I think this time factor links very much back to why you want to publish, because you need to keep your motivation going, and you also need to dedicate some time to this. So it's not out with some commitments. And I think, particularly for students, I think when you go on to publish, you know, I certainly recognize that the contribution that has been given to that. And I suppose it may be that your research or some of your findings or inquiry need to get out to the audience quickly. And I think that can be where blogs or Twitter can be very important if you have a critically important discovery or point of view that needs to get out there. Otherwise, publishing in a journal, a standard article, can take years, or it can take a matter of months, depending on the processes. So we've got a couple of people joining us. We've got Immaculate, and we've also got some.
Sorry, I came in late.
It's okay.
Hi.
It's okay.
Yeah. I hope I did.
So I've just muted you at the moment, just because there's a lot of background noise, but then we can unmute when we open it up a bit more for discussion. And because it's recorded, I'm not going to repeat the first few slides, so we'll just continue. But if the person who's dialed in on their telephone, oh, they've gone now, we'll catch them when they come back. So it's important to think about how much time you have available, and also how quickly you need to get your research or your research findings out. And most of you, particularly when you're new to writing, and even myself, it's very rare that I write anything on my own. We're normally part of a small group of authors who will commit to the paper and have often been involved in the research activity or the background activity. Just on that, when you look at particular journals, or if you Google it, there are fairly standard policies on what allows somebody to be a stated author on a paper. So it's also worth just checking out what the requirements are for authorship. And years ago, just about anybody and everyone who worked in a department would stick their names on a journal article just to get published, where now you have to show or have to be able to justify in terms of certain contributions that you've made. So in terms of support, well, if you're going on to write, then I think it's very appropriate for you to approach your supervisors if you've been doing dissertation. And I also think it would be nice if you approached myself as well. And the reason for that is because A, we're interested in the work that you've been doing, and also B, it's good for us to be able to share our own experience and point you in the direction of some of the resources that we might know about, or some of the particular situations that we've been involved with. I know when I started out in academia and I think I'd had a paper rejected by 2 journals, and I was exceptionally demoralized by this and started to think about a different career. And then I spoke to a senior academic, and he said that he had just got something published after 7 rejections by different journals. And I think it's that type of feedback and experience that can help keep us motivated and help us think about different directions to go through or to go down. There's a lot of resources now available over the internet, and there's various books and courses people can go on now to help them with writing. I've done some of these, and putting some of the techniques into practice can be a bit tricky, but I think there's a range of different approaches that people can take into how they then go about putting their writing together, and we can come on to that as well. So some of you may not be aware of the actual process that is involved. So firstly, the first few slides have covered your reasons for wanting to publish, what it is you might be thinking of publishing, and what journal you might want to approach, and the people that you want to be authors. So what happens is you then submit your draft article in a specific format that meets the requirements of the journal. They tend to have quite clunky websites, and so it's really important that you read through the instructions, and they will all have different methods. So you submit your article to the chosen journal, and you'll usually get an electronic receipt. And then you wait, and then you wait a bit longer, and you might have to wait quite a lot longer, and then eventually you will receive a reply from the editors. I've been waiting now for 4 months for a reply from a journal that I submitted an article to, and that's around 3 to 4 months is pretty standard. So don't be too concerned if you haven't heard anything within a matter of weeks. As long as you've got your proof of submitting to that journal, which you normally get by email after you've gone through the initial submission process. Once you've submitted your article, you will then at some point get feedback from the editors, which is not too indifferent to getting feedback from one of your assignments or from your dissertation itself. And there will be a set of reports, depending on the framework of the journal. And generally, you will see 2 reports from the reviewers, and they might vary in length from a few sentences to a page or even longer. And they're normally asked by the journal editor to answer particular questions relating to the type of article that you've submitted. From that information, the editor then makes a decision, and the decision is usually based on traffic lights again, and you may get a complete rejection, and the editor usually will give you some pointers as to why the article has been rejected. The second traffic light, I think I've got it here, the second traffic light is the maybe, and that's where they're going to give you consideration to submit a revision of the paper again. And it also, the green decision is going to be yes, they're going to accept it and they're going to publish the work. Most, I don't know what the figures are, but the vast majority of papers don't get accepted at the first submission. So again, don't feel that this is an indication of your academic ability. Some of the reasons papers get rejected at the first submission is just because the journal is not interested in that field of work. So that's why it's important to get a good sense of whether the journal you first approach may be the type of journal that would publish the work. Another way of finding that out is also to send an email to the editor, even before you submit an article, just to give them a few sentences about what it is you're considering to submit to that journal, and they may give you some feedback. I've done that on several occasions in the past, particularly when it's been an article that I really think the journal should be publishing, even though in the past they may not have been too interested in that field. Editors, journal editors, are just people like me who get co-opted or volunteer to take on these positions. And just as in academia overall, we're influenced and we have our own blind spots too. So that can be a helpful way forward. Another reason journal articles will get rejected, quite a common one, is that the submission hasn't been in the format or the framework that the journal wants. Just a bit like the dissertation or your essays, it was very important that you submitted them in a certain way, that the formatting was done in a certain way, and many journals are very particular about that. And another reason for rejection is that it might be poorly written, even though the science might be very important. And finally, one of the reasons for rejection is that it just might not be something that's, really important enough to take space up in that journal. When you look at journals, I'm often surprised at what they do and don't publish. So there's a wide range of variability in this, and I sort of think, have a stab at submitting and find out what then happens. Even if you may not think that the area of work that you've done has a high level of academic credibility or is up there with some of the leading researchers. There are also some student journals. I know the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, they have a student journal as well, and it can be worth considering some of those approaches. So this is to just reaffirm, don't get disheartened. It is disheartening. I've had tears. I know colleagues who have tears because this is a labor of love, and you're sort of waiting for that email. And I think I was talking to somebody who'd graduated from our course quite recently. They'd got a very important piece of work to be published, and they're now, I think they have been accepted in their third submission. So they've gone down, rejected by 2 journals. They're now on the 3rd journal, which is accepting the work but needs some revisions. And this lady was just getting to the point of, it's absolutely just not worth it. I'm not going to bother. But if you started out thinking it was worth it, then it's really important to keep that motivation going. And that's why it's good to have other authors or other members of a small team just to try and help you down that route. So writing is also an important learning opportunity. Because when you submit something to a journal, it gets seen by at least 2 reviewers. Some journals might use 4 reviewers, and then it gets seen by the editor as well. Now, again, these reviewers, there's no reason why each of you can't ask to be a reviewer for a particular journal. I've been a reviewer for many journals over the years, and they're just people like you and me who will review a paper based on certain questions the editor may have asked them to look at. And then you give a review, you give your feedback as to how important, or the importance of the journal publishing it, and some of the concerns or some of the strengths and weaknesses you have about the paper. Now that's a real learning opportunity, because then you can use that feedback from the reviewers to enhance your paper, to see things that you hadn't necessarily thought about. And some of them may be leading experts who will then point you in the direction of some new or emerging literature. Now, it's also important not to take to heart everything reviewers say, because there might be things in their feedback that you don't really agree with, or they might just be an indication of the reviewer not necessarily understanding a point that you were trying to make. And again, that highlights that when you resubmit to another journal, that you might need to make certain issues, certain lines of inquiry might need to be explained in a little bit more detail. So then you would think about an alternative journal to submit your work to. And again, that's a matter of looking at the journal requirements and then following through the same process. I came across this image the other week. I was searching for something else, and this fell into my sort of line of sight. And I think this really does help us. And I printed this off. I have it on my wall now. In fact, you probably can see it above my head on the post on the board behind me. And I think this really does show that, as with anything, there's a lot of work that goes on underneath that we don't see, that others have been doing. And it also sort of helps us keep going when we may be feeling a little less motivated to continue with the work. So a few of my top tips, and I'm not going to put this Roger's top tips for success, because like all of you and like me and like a lot of other people I know, that there is no sort of I don't know what the word is really, but there's no sort of clear defined route that will guarantee, that's the word, that's going to guarantee you're going to get something published. But I think these are some things that we can consider. And the first of these is, even though I don't think I'm very good at writing, is that all of us can write. What we need to do is start writing in a way that suits the journal, that is of interest to other people, and in a way that's at a standard or in a format that is appropriate. The iceberg illusion, print it off, stick it on your notice board, and keep it in mind. So don't feel you know, that you're not able to continue with this if you're finding it exceptionally difficult or a bit demotivating from comments you might be getting. Don't expect to get published first time round. Of course, it's fantastic when it happens, but from my track record over the years, I reckon by about the third submission to a different journal that I then get published. And when we do get rejected, it's often that it's a reflection of what the editor wants that journal to be publishing, rather than a reflection of your writing or your academic credibility. Learn from the reviewers. As we've said, they can provide some important feedback, but ignore or leave aside some of the comments that really aren't helpful. And one of the tips I was told, which is helpful really, is that I think with writing a paper, just like with a dissertation really, it's important to start breaking it down into the different sections rather than trying to just take on this whole piece of work all at once. And be realistic. I've never sent any of my work to the Lancet, and that doesn't mean that students can't send their work to the Lancet, because some have done and some have got published. But be realistic in terms of where your work is likely to get published. And develop a plan, something I'm not very good at doing, but I know some people who seem to publish quite a lot. They have quite a rigorous timetable, and they will set themselves targets and milestones to keep them going down the right route. Identify people to work with, to support you, and just start. There's a book that has a lovely title, and it's called Writing to Learn, Not Learn to Write, which is very much about the process of, it's not until we actually start writing that our writing develops. And I'm sure that you've found that when you've been doing some of your assignments or the dissertation. So that's a bit of a quick whistle-top tour of I guess, my reflections on the ways in which I've been writing papers, and also some of the I don't know, I guess, process routes through which this can be done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmic everybody, and then I'm going to go through the discussion board as well, just to pick up on one or two questions that there are already, because I know Joe typed something quite in advance. Reviews, is there any problem in submitting communication for my dissertation has been marked? Okay, certainly there's no problem in having a paper published that relates to your dissertation. I think it adds academic credibility to the dissertation if it then has been published. And I also think that you're learning additional skills because you're learning how to write a paper which is far shorter and usually only includes some components of the dissertation itself. But you have to be careful of not self-plagiarizing yourself, because your dissertation will be put through the Turnitin plagiarism detection software. And if you've already published, it would then pick that up, and it would treat that just as it would as if you were including work from another author that wasn't referenced. So be very mindful of that if you've already published some of your work prior to having your dissertation marked. But generally, I think it's a brilliant step to be going down. And let's just go through the next question we've got here from Monica. Monica, do you just want to explain your question? I don't really understand it. Sorry.
I've got a result which is of interest to some patient groups. Should you be telling those patient groups that what result you've got, or should you leave everything until publication?
Really interesting question. Actually, I've never thought it before. I can't see that there's any problem with that, actually. Check the journal requirements, but because, in fact, in one sense, it's important to get the findings out to patient groups. So I don't think there's a problem with that.
I mean, there are, for instance, there's one patient group that could put it in their kind of newsletter, which goes out to several thousand people. Now, is that not then making it less likely that it would want to be that journals would want to publish it, or not?
Arguably, it'd make them more interested, because they would realise that there's a readership out there, and that they're getting information, or they're interested in that topic. Whether it's then reducing the impact of the own, of a formal publication, or the importance of that. unless it's, you know, to be honest, I would contact the editor of the journal.
Right.
I really don't know the answer to that. And it's going to be very variable. And I know, you know, your dissertation is quite, it's pushing through to really change potential practice in the way patients are treated. So I would contact an editor. And if you don't get anywhere, if you email me, and then I'll speak to somebody here just to get their view as well.
Right.
Oh, and Joe, thanks for sending that link through. That's the same organisation that I've used to get guidance for authorship from. And I think what it does, because I've used it here when I got embroiled in a bit of a discussion where somebody felt that their colleague ought to have been an author because they'd done the data entry. And when I showed them this guidance, it made it very clear that just being part of a research project is not in and of itself necessarily then making that person having rights to be an author. So Dorothy and Immaculate, thanks for joining us as well. So it's a bit like, you know, this is just an open discussion really. So, I mean, I know Monica's thinking strongly about publication. Sounds, Joe, as if you're starting to think about publication already. Immaculate and Dorothy, is this something that's high on your horizons at the moment?
I just completed my dissertation for the MPH. So yeah, I was trying to look at how I can put this information that I got together. And it's about it was a systematic that was about enablers and factors that hinder people from attending cervical cancer screening services. Yeah, so there are some very good points and recommendations. So I'm working on seeing how to get a publication out of that. But then I also look at a comment from Joe Weldon asking about some journals that may end up that want searches that were done like 12 months within publication. So yeah, so what happens when you keep trying to publish and then you get in 6 months and then you have to try again and then yeah.
It's a really good question. Let me just pick up on something around systematic reviews as well. Journals will want the systematic review to have had at least two reviewers involved who have identified and reviewed and taken, done the data extraction independently of each other, and then where they double check against each other. Now, what some people do is they're in a situation where they're able to develop that as part of the dissertation. I know Monica did. But that doesn't mean if you've only been the single reviewer for the work in the dissertation, because what you're then in a position to do is to find somebody else who then go through and act as the second reviewer. But sometimes I've done that for a student and we got the work published. So sometimes that might be approaching a supervisor or myself. It might be approaching another student or a past student or just a colleague at work. But because you've done a lot of the legwork in terms of developing the search method, developing the study protocol, developing the data extraction form, it is nowhere near as arduous a process as what it has been for you. Because a lot of that work has been done. But if you look at the PRISMA guidelines for the standards of reviews, the journal is exceptionally unlikely to publish a review that hasn't had independent, hasn't had a second person at least who's been involved in data extraction. And that, you know, it's obvious why. It's because to reduce bias, which is really what reviews are all about. Now, the question about keeping searches, the outcomes of searches updated, is one that's just hit my colleagues and I on the head, because we've done a review of, our review is actually of studies that have been published on a particular topic, which is educational research in public health. And they're now saying that our review is 2 years out of date because we did the search in 2015 and we're now just starting 2018. And it's not uncommon to have to update the review.
Oh.
Because I don't know necessarily what time factor journal editors will put around it, but I think for it to be more than a year out of date when you submit it, it's really going to be a cause for question. And in a way, you want to make sure that the research that you do publish is as up to date as it can be, because you wouldn't want to miss a paper that got published that actually could have been important to your work, because that then will mean that the readership are not going to be interested in your work because they know that another paper's come out that may have some influence on what your conclusion was. Now, because you've already got your search strategies set up, it's not that difficult to keep it updated. And it's not that difficult to then add those findings to the tables and to your flowcharts. It may be that it will have a major impact on your findings. The chances are that it doesn't, but if it does, that really highlights the importance of keeping your search up to date, which, you know, we ought to be anyway, and certainly something that Cochrane, you know, I think they still struggle with, but they do get their reviews updated, I think, within a 3 to 5 year period. So it's something to keep in mind, I think, when you're developing your processes, is to think about in the future. If you're anything like me, I end up with files and things scattered all over the place, when really you want to have a nice logical process system that can, which is then more straightforward for you to be able to update, or for somebody else to be able to run in future. And yes, Monica, you have to update the consonant flowchart. And that can act as a guide, really, for the additional information that you're collecting. It's part of the labor of love, really, is this work. And with some journal articles, you know, it may not be relevant to update it, but certainly for systematic reviews. And often, you know, you're probably going to be seeing some of this literature anyway, if it's an area of work that you're interested in too. And what I do is, I'm signed up for a lot of automatic table of contents from journals. So I tend to see relevant publications if they're coming through, but of course that's not reliable. So you would have to do the searches again. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Dorothy, don't apologize. So it's good that you can hear us. And if you've got any direct questions, to type them. But what I want to think about also is the next steps, and whether is to think about who you might then want to get to help you, and to what extent you would want help from somebody at the university. And I think if you're wanting to then approach people here, for example, it's then about ensuring that you're working on something which is A, that you're committed to getting it through, and B, that you've got a good sense of what type of journals that article might get into. Now, I'm also thinking of Monica here, and I think we need to build this into the MPH as well, is when you're doing systematic reviews, well, with any research, you can get the protocols published, or you can try and get the protocols published. And I think it's worth trying to do that, Monica, and looking at finding journals that publish study protocols of systematic reviews that would cover a topic that's relevant to your work.
It's already published on Prospero. You're suggesting publishing in addition to that actually in a journal?
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, Prospero is the register, isn't it? The register of systematic reviews. Whereas when you're writing a journal article, it wouldn't literally just be the protocol. Again, it would have some of the, the literature, the reason for why you've done the review in that way, why is it important? And obviously you're talking, the language you would be using would be past tense because it would be about then, and this is how we're going to do it, but actually you've already done it.
Right. So you do it in the future tense?
Yes, I suspect so. Yeah.
Right.
I'm not sure, actually. It also depends if you were, this thing around tenses is also discipline specific at times, because a lot of the nursing journals, they write in the present or future tense, where in a lot of the more medical focused journals, we tend to write in the past tense. So there's no hard and fast rule, to be honest. It's a long time since I've published a study protocol, but it's well worth thinking about. And because you've done a lot of that work already and a lot of that discussion around it already, I think, it's not starting from scratch. Great, Dorothy, that you have, you're already involved in the process, and you've already been getting some manuscripts, and it is a challenging or difficult task.
Roger, do we have to first register the protocol with Prospero before publishing with any journal?
You don't have to, but it's good practice. Good practice. Yeah. Monica, was it quite straightforward to do?
Very, very easy. And it helped me enormously in the writing of the MRes, the actual dissertation. I could block things from that across to the dissertation. And it had helped clarify my thoughts a great deal, having to put it on the Prospero website. Made it very much clearer actually doing the review, because when we came across problems with the review, whether to keep a particular study in the review or not, we'd look back at what we'd published on protocol and compare the wording exactly to see if it matched.
Yeah, that's and I think that's what also adds to the credibility of the findings of the review that you then do publish, because then people can look back and they can go, oh, actually, they did stick to that published protocol, or maybe they may have done something different. And if they don't recognize that, then that can be a critique of the study.
Okay.
It's worth looking into. It doesn't cost.
Yeah, sure.
Monica, in terms of when people move away, you know, all people can do is say yes or no, so it's well worth contacting him.
Okay.
I think he's gone to Bristol.
Yeah, no, he's gone to Brighton.
Brighton, is it?
I mean, I've actually got his email address. It's just the difficulty of liaising at more distance.
Yeah. So I think it's great that a number of you are thinking about publishing and are at different stages. It's something where it's one of those things where I think you just have to seek support from different people, and there's some really good websites actually. I've put some of them, I highlighted some of the dissertation materials, I think, but you know, if you're bored, just play around on the internet just to see, you know, put in some Google terms around how to write a paper or top tips for academics, and you can get, I mean, there was one I was reading the other day, and this guy said that he got up at 4 o'clock in the morning because that was his best time to write. And I thought, it's not until about lunchtime before I'm even able to, you know, to start writing properly. But different people find different ways that work. But one of the research on this actually is that you're more successful if you actually do a small amount of work every day, even if it's just half an hour, rather than trying to find a day or hours in the future to do some work on this. And I know when I follow that approach, I've got things published in a shorter period of time overall. So I think there is something in that. If you're just, even if that half an hour is downloading articles into Mendeley or checking a reference or working on one of your tables or reading the guidance for the journal, you know, I think that persistence and, you know, small step after small step on a daily basis, I think can really help get your paper through. Monica, I think that's an important point. If you then make changes, which is, you know, it's very appropriate to make changes to a review protocol once it's been on Prospero, and I think it is good to recognise it in your subsequent publication. Yeah. Oh, that's helpful, Joe. I hope I sort of look to you all to sort of tell me whether I'm on the right tracks, but I think I am. It sounds as if some of the things I'm saying are making sense, so that's good. So we're just coming up to the hour, really. So I encourage you all to think about some of the things, to look at what resources you can get from elsewhere, and contact me or other people who you think might be able to help you, and go for it. It's a real achievement to get published, and I think, you know, it can then set you off down different routes of thinking. You can often then get people who will contact you, sharing their experiences if the patients, or sharing some of their own work, or they might want to collaborate with you again in future. So it can just feel a bit lonely because we're normally doing it in an office on our own. But it is important, particularly because it's a topic that you're particularly that is close to your heart in different ways. So go for it, and let us know how you get on. Certainly if you do get published, or you do get your work presented at a conference, you know, then let me know, because we like to, you know, showcase what the MPH has helped support, and also the hard work that you've all been doing. So I think it's time to sign off. Thank you again for joining. If you're in England, hopefully the snow isn't near you. Though I said this to a student the other day who was in Canada, and she said, "Of course, the snow. It's minus 12 degrees." So she didn't. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Radia. This was very helpful.
Brilliant. Thank you all. Thanks.
Bye.